So I think you're going to see more interest in chemical hazards coming in the next 5, 10 years. Um, so this exposure consumption is going to be necessary. I think you're going to see more toxicologists employed at companies too.
I'm Jan Sugadolski, and I'm really excited to have with me Scott Hawkes, who is an expert, introducing himself as an expert in food safety, in mycotoxin, and the evaluation of pet foods. So Scott, welcome, and do you want to tell us about yourself a little bit, as much as you want?
Thank you. Yeah, currently I am a food safety and regulatory affairs consultant for Tox Strategies, but I've spent 30 plus years in the food, both animal food and human food industry. Worked in the U.S. mostly, but a significant amount of time in Asia. So that's kind of the short version of my career.
Okay, you want to tell us the long version a little bit, or what kind of is your focus area at the moment? What was it like in the beginning? How did you develop yourself over the time?
I started doing. I'm a protein chemist and a microbiologist by training, so I started doing research at Cornell University in very, very, very basic protein chemistry with cheese whey. And at some point, I think after about 5 years, a couple of patents later, they had a pilot plant that New York State had funded for small businesses that couldn't afford research facilities for themselves. So, but also worked with most of the Fortune 100 food companies on pilot scale projects. In that process, we had to be certified HACCP, or else things that we made couldn't be used for things like sensory testing or trade show, presentations, like a yogurt with a new flavor. So that was my first introduction into food safety, and I really liked it because it's you have to be pragmatic about how do you achieve it. So I did that. Then I went out into the public sphere, and I worked for Covance Laboratories. So that was a totally different. It was a technical sales role, but the interesting thing is when you think of a laboratory. The only time that people send you samples over their routine is when they're having problems, right? There's some root cause investigation. So a lot of reasons people used Covance is because people like me were out in the field that were more technical than sales, and we would help them design experiments, interpret data. Then I started getting a lot of regulatory questions. And because people assume, oh, well, food science, regulatory. But of course, there is no such course that they teach you, at least not at that time. So how I got into food safety and regulatory was Michigan State had a certification course online, which is still there. Excellent. I think University of Minnesota has one now too. But it's a really good idea because what it teaches you is, where do I go to get regulatory information, and a little bit about the language, which sometimes can be challenging. What does it mean? So I did that. Then Covance sent me overseas to Singapore to build a nutritional analysis and microbiological laboratory. So I did that for almost 2 years, and then met some folks from Nestle who hired me in Singapore to implement, at that time, ISO 22000 food safety standards in the region of Asia, Oceania, and Africa, and specifically for their R&D facility in Singapore. So I learned I always talk that it's going to Nestle University because it was really an incredible experience. I did that for about 4 years, and then due to parents getting older, Singapore's a long way from the U.S., came back to the United States, worked for a pet food company, implementing at that time FSMA standards in a pet food manufacturing facility that they had just purchased. So I did that for 4 years, got the plant up to standard. Then we had to get even closer to parents. So got a job with Tata Global Beverages, which in the U.S. owns 8 O'Clock Coffee and Tetley Tea. But I did get to go to India, work at some water facilities. I implemented the FSMA standards for coffee, which is that's a very different product than most food products. But all my career like that has been, after that I was going to retire, but then talk to Tox Strategies, and so I'm working for Tox Strategies now. But doing the same things I've always done. It's been my passion since way back at the Cornell days when I picked up HACCP.
ICC Animal Nutrition, a Brazilian company with 30 years of history and present in more than 70 different countries, providing natural, sustainable, and technological solutions for animal nutrition, health, and well-being in a safe and scientific way, adding value in food production and helping to feed the world.
Well, that's amazing. That's a long, long history, a lot of experiences. So do you think it's like a career path that is common for people in your field, or is it just you kind of right at the right time?
I think there are people, I knew many of them that are excellent quality, food safety. My career has always been one of just accident. I just thought, I took the sales job because I was afraid to do it, right? And so I thought, well, the worst that can happen is I can fail. But it taught me many things: how to get to a point quickly, to look at things from a customer's point of view. And by customer, I do mean if I'm the food safety person and talking to the plant manager, I need to listen because they also have a very challenging life, right? Because it's all about profitability. And so we want food to be safe, but if the company doesn't make any money, then it doesn't really matter. So it's that challenge it taught me. But yeah, my career's always been that. I had no idea how to build a laboratory. I just figured the worst that could happen is I would fail at it.
That's a very good attitude. So for young generations, like young students now that want to go obviously pet food science, pet food nutrition, and so on, what would you kind of recommend them based on your own experience?
If you're going to go into the food safety field, if you're trying to choose a major, choose either food science with a heavy focus on microbiology.
Okay.
Or go into microbiology with some focus on food. Because let's face it, the biggest risks, whether it be animal or human food, a lot of times involves microbes, right? Even mycotoxins involve mold. So, you will not be unhappy about that. But there are other, right, quality, regulatory, then maybe you don't need as heavy, but I would certainly recommend educating yourself in regulations, how to do that. Chemistry, basic food chemistry, learn those things, because if you have good foundations, you can do a lot of things. But if you specialize in one thing but didn't focus on the foundational sciences, it's harder to adapt to new things, and we face them every day, especially in food and animal feed. It's new stuff every day.
So what do you think are the biggest challenges at the moment? Where you say new things happen every day? Is there kind of...
I think there's still new things, like I think the most recent one in pet food was the thyroid hormones, right? Now that's been a little bit ago, but we never talked about that when I was doing that. It came kind of out of the blue. It was like, oh wow, that wasn't even a realized hazard that I ever saw anybody talk about. I think mycotoxins will continue. I think FDA, they're looking at ochratoxin A. They're looking at coming up with some new action limits, regulatory limits, and guidance limits for mycotoxins, because I think they're realizing, more and more is being found out from a toxicology perspective that we have to do our best. And pets don't do well with mycotoxins.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, unlike, they're more, I guess it would be, when I think of anything pet, that is equivalent to infant formula, right? I mean, or infant food, because they consume it every day. You and I, sure, we get exposed to things, but we don't eat a varied diet, and so it doesn't it doesn't have that accumulation in our system like it does for pets. So thinking about things that way. So mycotoxins, I think, will continue to expand. Salmonella is always going to be an issue just because of the ingredients. And so I think there's going to be there are new technologies because you always want faster and faster results. Just being careful that methods are valid and that you're getting, so that you're getting the result. You can make good decisions because the sampling was proper and the test was proper. I think those are going to continue to be the challenges. There probably will always be, like melamine came up and really impacted the pet food industry. Again, so it did so in infant formula also, right? Again, because they consume, you and I'm sure we've probably been exposed to melamine, but if we don't get it every day in the dose in the food, it's a different hazard, a risk factor. So who knows what they're going to there's always an economic motivation to do those things. So what's my advice to people? Any ingredient that's expensive is going to be worth it for someone with nefarious attitudes to adulterate and make a little extra money, right? So
we can stay on this line. I just want to go one step back before we forget the new generation, right? Because all the experiences is amazing, right? And also your thoughts. But if somebody does now a PhD or like a undergrad, and he goes to a graduate program, obviously it's a short time. But what would you recommend externships, or if they can have limited amount to be exposed to externships, for example, right? What kind of in this area would you recommend they should try to? Which companies to go? What kind of companies? So to get the most exposure in the early career, right?
Yeah, I think any position that they can get where you're actually making the product, or you see how the product is made every day, you are going to learn. I don't care if it's a small company, if it's a big company, even if I know how it is when you start out of college. Maybe you don't get paid as much. But I throughout my career, I've seen a dearth of people who have to make decisions about product that don't really understand how the product is made. And so you may know microbiology, you may know chemistry, you may know food safety, but if you're not out in that plant observing how people do their jobs and really understanding the challenges that they face, you will have a difficult time later in your career, like auditing, right? Auditing is hard. Good auditors it's not easy to become one. I admire them. But one of the things that helps, the best auditors that I ever knew were people who had been plant managers, who had been, operations people. So anything that can do, why do I say that? So for instance, maybe you go in a warehouse and somebody says, well, I clean this once a week. But you look at that warehouse, and if you had to do the cleaning, which some of the jobs I had to do those things, you could see right away there's no way you clean this once a week. Maybe the bags aren't on pallets. How are you going to move them, to get behind? And so you go look in that area and you start to find things, right? But why do I know those things? I know those things because I did jobs that were, maybe not at what some people would say my education level, but those jobs taught me more than anything else, right? I mean, in dairy, I know how to take a homogenizer apart, and what you learn from that, or pumps, what you learn from that, why did I take them apart? To clean them. On a pilot scale, you have to clean, right? It's not quite clean in place, everything. So, but what that teaches you is where can microbes hide? Where you just don't get that if you don't do things. So never be afraid to get in there and see how the product is made if you're going to go into food safety or feed safety. I developed relationships with people who knew way more than me about how the product was made, and those relationships, they mentored me a lot. So I taught them maybe a tiny bit about, something. They taught me a lot about, oh yeah, this is how the product is made. So.
Oh, that's great advice. You mentioned before diagnostics or validation, right? And I think that is probably in your field and a very important one. In my field, that's, I think I have the feeling in a science, we're getting less and less using tests that really validate it, correct?
Yes.
And that's so, can you kind of maybe give us a few examples why this is so important to have real understanding of a validated test and how you usually go about it?
I'll tie in my red Solo Cup story with it because validation also includes sampling, right? Sampling is very important because probably one of the greatest sources of error when you're talking about a sampling and testing plan has to do with the sampling itself. So if you think about, okay, there's lots of mycotoxin tests, very rapid ones, right, that you do at receiving and stuff. And it is important so on the method side, you want to send some sample to a lab that has a certain amount of aflatoxin, and you get an outside lab to use LCMS or some other validated method, and you cross-reference that with your rapid method, and you should be doing that, right? But as we know, there's a lot less error in that than the person who is watching the 20-ton truck come in of corn and sampling that. And because mycotoxin comes from mold, which is not evenly distributed, right? It's in pockets. So your probability of finding that is very low. And even with proper sampling, it's still low. But if you sample properly, you'll get a representative sample of that truck. And there are guidances. USDA has very good manuals on how to sample different containers and things. Why is that important for pet food? Is because we've had pet deaths many times from aflatoxin poisoning. So it is a real threat to pets. Yeah. So the validation part is you also want to make sure you validate that you're sampling properly. And the way I learned this is when I first came in, they were testing aflatoxin. They were unconcerned. I said, yeah, no. Once I found out, hey, this will kill pets. We have to be very cautious about this, where we're getting things. And they're, we've never seen it, Scott. And I'm like, ever? And they're like, nope, never even detected it. And I was like, So I walked out to the dock. I watched the guy. He gets a red Solo cup. He goes up on the truck, takes a scoop out of the top, comes back down, gives it to the lab. They take it and test it. That was their sampling program. And since I've told that story in the pepper, it happens. There are people, they don't realize, no, the probability you are ever going to find aflatoxin in anything with that sampling is like almost zero. So once they started sampling properly, it wasn't that they didn't detect aflatoxin, it wasn't that all of a sudden they found it above, the harmful level, but they did find it at times, right? Which is what we would expect, normal. So their method was fine, but the entire process, when you say validation, sampling has to be considered as part of it, right? So there's a lot of people, oh yeah, we validated our method, show me your sampling. That's usually the weakest point is, oh, well, we just take some sample. Micro, same thing, finished product testing for salmonella. It's very difficult to get a representative sample. And your probability of finding salmonella in finished product is very low. So if you find it, or if you find aflatoxin above, the limit, well, then it's a big problem, not a small one. Mm-hmm. And so that's the part I think people kind of forget is finished product testing or even testing for mycotoxins doesn't say, oh, I don't have a problem. It just kind of verifies that the moisture control that's being executed, your processing, cleaning, if you're talking about salmonella, that those things are in line. Okay. Right? Because you're talking about very low levels of contamination. This is very difficult to pick up, especially when it's not evenly distributed. But if you find it, there's a systemic problem. It's not because Scott forgot to wash his hands and touched something. It would be everybody didn't wash their hands, or you're not cleaning. There's some areas you're missing, or the corn has been held at inappropriate conditions, too high a moisture, that kind of thing, right? It's big, and this is why you see FDA react the way they do. If they find it in the marketplace, they already know. They'll send 10 officers, inspectors to collect samples. They already know. It's the probability they were going to find that is so low that it has to be some systemic problem at the manufacturer. I don't know if that's valuable to people, but that's the reality of the food safety challenges we face. Mostly they're just not evenly distributed, so they're hard to find through testing.
No, that's very interesting. I never considered this way. Just maybe because we have a lot of audience that are not in the field, or they're very wide field. So, it's probably difficult, but can you give us a little bit of a feeling? So how would you sample the 40-ton truck? What's kind of an average strategy?
If you look at think of a 20-ton, open top truck, and you look at it from the top, you could even sketch it out. If you have several choices, but the first one is you draw out like a number 5 on a die, and you plunge down. They have, samplers with many compartments. You plunge that down in those locations. So you're kind of taking the samples from 5 different places of that truck all the way down to the bottom of it, taking those, pooling those together, grinding them all up. And now you have, as good as you can do. Could you do 7? Like some trucks are 7, although usually that's a little bit bigger, like maybe a rail car or a 50-ton load. So, but all of this is in that USDA guidance. They've done such a good job describing what you are supposed to do for sampling, but it's well worth it. It doesn't take that long to read through it, because you could just look at the picture, say, oh, okay. And they describe the tools that you can help. Now, there are a lot of companies right now, bigger ones, They have the air operated, it just goes over the truck, samples it, pulls it, takes it to the lab. But if you have to do it by hand, the principle is the same.
And I guess the same thing for salmonella too, or is it just whatever?
So finished product testing is harder, right? Ideally, what you would like, and I think it's in the you can find an example of the difference on how sampling happens. But if you take discrete samples every half hour or every 15 minutes or whatever and pool them together as it's coming in, as it's being packed. I think if you have salmonella, I want to say at 0.1% or something like that, which is still a lot if you think it's a pathogen, but it's a low-level contamination. I think there's about less than 2% chance you're going to find it. Even with all that, think of 8 hours and taking it, every 15 minutes or half an hour. Ideally, what you'd like to do is take a little bit all the time, right? Like have just a portion go, but it's not very practical to do that. But if you did do it that way, where you were constantly sampling, you probably have a 95% chance that you're going to find salmonella. Mm-hmm. But since that's really, I've never seen that executed or anything. It's really, I think if you had a 1% contamination, it's probably 1 in 100 or less that you're going to find salmonella, and that's a lot of contamination. Right. The reason we do it, though, is you would be able to, what it would detect is if you have some systemic problem, you are going to find it. Mm-hmm. Because it's going to be more contagious. And if you think about it, all of us are exposed to salmonella. I guarantee it. We at some point. It's a ubiquitous organism. So that sample, the important part is to try to get it. So, every half hour, whatever, regular, discrete testing, and understand that you very, very small chance you're going to find anything, even if it's there. But that also means when you do, you have to immediately, it isn't a question of, maybe it's a big problem. That would be my, there are limitations with it.
If you find it, you have a problem, right?
You've got to do something about it.
No, that's great. Because, I think I never consider it this way because I'm on the other side of the story, right?
Yeah.
No, that's really very exciting. I have one question. You also brought some other experiences up. So you said something about billy goats.
Oh, yeah.
So bring some other anecdotes from your experiences.
Yes. So I was in an Asian country and supposed to set up a warehouse distribution center that was strategically important to the company. And when I went in, I was doing the audit and everything looked fine. It was clean inside. It was, of course, they knew I was coming. So sometimes it does look clean inside. But as I was kind of finishing up with my list of here's the things I think you're going to have to do, I saw out of the corner of my eye down one of the warehouse aisles a billy goat.
Inside?
Why? And I thought, and it was hot. Very hot. And so I thought maybe I was hallucinating or something. And then I see a man going by with a rope. And then he comes back leading the goat out of the warehouse. So I asked the manager, I said, did I just see a billy goat? I mean, or am I hallucinating? He goes, oh, no. Sometimes they bring the animals in and, because they don't have anybody to take care of it at home. They're working. Somebody's sick and can't take care of the animal. And there, it is an important food source. So when we looked out, I saw they just had this pen sort of still within the range of the property. For animals that they had to babysit when somebody's, family was sick, couldn't take care of the animal. And I was like, yeah, no, we can't have that. That's not going to work. But we were able to work with them and as you know, we found a vet who would come and look at the animals, right, to make sure they're not diseased, helped us set up a place where they could be quarantined and taken care of. He was very helpful to how do we handle this and what's the risk, right, of this, because they can't be in the warehouse. So and the lesson I got from that was you can achieve a standard without saying, well, I can't achieve it here. I can achieve it in Europe or the US. And no, you have to achieve it, but you may have to take a different approach to do it.
So I guess it's a lot of challenges. Other experiences like this that you had?
I mean, there always is. And if you get 4 food safety people that have been in it a long time, you're always going to see things like this, especially when you think of pet food, it's agricultural. Right, so you do have to visit farms, but I remember there was a incident where somebody sent a picture of a blueberry with a shotgun pellet in it, and so I was looking. I'm like, I know that's a shotgun pellet. I grew up in the farming area, so what we found out was that they were having a bird problem. And they were shooting the birds, and then the pellets would come down on the field and land in the blueberry. So it was a pretty intensive root cause to find out, and then what's the danger of the pellet being in the blueberry and that kind of thing. But those are the things that happen in an agricultural setting. I've also found it in cans of pet food. And you go and find out they have a pest problem, and somebody was shooting, at the pest. It happens a lot. The closer you get to the farm, the more it's not like a nice, neat manufacturing situation. But I would encourage any person in the field to go as far back in the supply chain as they can. Again, where are my ingredients coming from and how are they made, right? That's an important thing to know, because once it comes in, if you're a pet food manufacturing plant, once it comes into your plant, you inherited the risk. So best to know what kind of risks am I inheriting.
No, that's a great advice. But I guess there's a challenge probably between closer nationally or international kind of, correct?
Yes, it is. It also matters about, this is where, I talk about hazard analysis, which should be the first thing you do, because you need to understand what's high risk, what's low risk. So if you have an ingredient that's high risk, it's worth it to go see how that's made, to take a look, focus on the things, so don't do. A lot of people will do. Most suppliers have some certification nowadays. It's hard to do business without some third-party certification. Not always, but some. Don't redo that audit. Look at the risk in that ingredient, and from the risk, you can say, okay, this control is important, right? I'm going to see how they execute that control at the plant and all the activities around that support it, like cleaning and hygiene. And I'm going to look at that because many times if you do have to travel, even overseas, you don't have a lot of time, right? It's going to cost a lot of money, but it isn't. There are times if the risk is high, I would try to get budgeted to go visit wherever I'm getting my stuff to understand how they control the hazard.
Yeah. Can you give me an example? So just to understand, so what ingredient, for example, would be like a high valuable ingredient, and what exactly you mean afterwards? What exactly would you look at?
Ingredients that are high risk for salmonella, or any animal products are going to have salmonella, and you can't ask for salmonella free. Now that is going to that, though, is going to go through your extrusion step if you're making kibble, or if you're canning, it's going to go through a thermal process. So that's a hazard but it's probably controlled. But anything added afterwards, after the kill step, should be looked at. And, many people use oils of different things, flavors, and that could be flavors. A lot of times are exposed to a lot of heat, but oil is safe in the sense that it doesn't support the growth of microorganisms. But I have found salmonella in oils that were going to be put on as coating on a kibble.
Okay.
And so that is something, anything after a kill step should be looked at. If I'm receiving some kind of dry ingredient, some flavors are, but something I'm going to put on after the kill step, then what I'll do is go there and look at, kind of get an idea of how they process it. Usually there is a high temperature, because you're extracting flavor. So usually there's some, what I would say is a kill step. What I want to know is, how do you handle after that? Because these are dry ingredients, and salmonella loves a dry environment, right? It can survive a decade, be around. Yeah. And as long as it's not exposed to water, you won't have problems. But of course, you're going to have roof leaks. You're going to have condensation from pipes. You're going to have leaky pipes. And depending on how a dry facility handles that, you can create big post contamination problems in a dry plant. If you look at low moisture food, most of the salmonella events are because of not properly monitoring and not properly cleaning and managing moisture in that dry section after the dryer. It's where it becomes tricky. So those are places. Anything after the kill step's high risk. I want to take a look.
So for salmonella, that would be the focus area, right?
Yeah.
And mycotoxins, I would assume that's much earlier.
Yeah, mycotoxins is interesting, right? So that's a good question, because it's on the other end of the supply chain. But if you think about how mycotoxins come about, it starts from the farm, right? Maybe drought causes a lot of problems, right? Because the plant gets weak and can't fend off, and it gets kind of, if you've ever seen corn, what it looks like when it's been in dry, it's not good. It's not a good. Mm-hmm. So that makes it weak. It's also the moisture at which the farmer harvests, which we know is not always under their control. Maybe it's a really wet, season, and they have to get it when they can get it. That if that goes in a silo and you're above 14% moisture, you're going to have opportunity for mold growth. And then temperature. So if you think about, it's why mycotoxins are hard, because it's regional. So corn from South Carolina is just naturally going to be a little higher risk for mycotoxins than northern Indiana, because northern Indiana is colder, drier. It's it's a different condition. But I know a lot of people in the pet food, I would suspect most people have this as a preventive control. A lot of people say, well, I let my supplier take care of that. Okay, but you still are going to have to verify, and you're still going to have to sample. And then that gets back to the sampling discussion you and I had. So as a pet food manufacturer, would I go look at corn? I might, or any other grain. Would I go look at it? Yeah, if I can. But again, I'm more interested in, how do we verify that supplier? Like, if I go, I want to see how they're sampling. How do they control? Do they have their silos ventilated? How well do they control? And what's the risk that you're going to have these drought or heavy rain conditions, right? So I would go to those, but I would still recommend that you have a robust sampling and testing program for mycotoxins. It's just so hard for anybody to really get it.
Mm-hmm. Is it actually increasing in incidence, mycotoxins? What is the kind of development, you think?
I don't think so. I think it's that we're looking for it more now, right? So I remember when FSMA first came out and the produce rule came out, and then people all of a sudden you started to see listeria and E. coli, and people, friends were calling me, I don't want to eat my broccoli anymore. I kind of laughed. I said, it's always been there. It's just now we're looking for it. And it's not, that doesn't mean it's not a problem. It just means once you start looking for something, you're going to have more probability of finding it. And I do think people are getting better at sampling, right? So now you have a higher probability that you will find it. So I think it's just a journey, but that's always going to be, nature finds a way. So it's always going to be a challenge, because how are you going to stop mold growth? There may be, there are photo sorting technologies and things like that, right? That are pretty impressive. It's just, so I think the incidence will continue to go down and down, but it's still a big challenge.
Let me just verify something so I could really understand, because I think it's fascinating, because sometimes we think in different directions. So on the field itself, that's kind of seasonal, right? It's more afterwards the mold comes, more or less in the whole harvesting, supplier, moisture, things like that. That's what you're trying.
Yep.
Another question I had is actually very burning on mind. So on our veterinary side, right, in the vet field, we're starting using more and more fiber, right? So we're trying to use like psyllium, some other sources, so adding to diets, adding a supplement.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across recently some information, like some of the fiber sources, like psyllium, for example, may have heavy metals, correct?
Oh,
on the
yeah.
So on. Could they maybe expand on this a little bit, if you know? Because I think that's a very, very hot topic, fibers and prebiotics, but we don't really think often that they can also be contaminated, right?
Sure. And then once you get to chemical, right, and this has been a learning experience for me from working at Tox Strategies, right? Because most of the people I work with are toxicologists. And so then you get into exposure and how much is consumed. So it's much trickier than we know. Salmonella, the presence of salmonella can cause an infection and hurt somebody. Even one cell can. When you get into things like heavy metals or pesticides, now you get into, okay, how much is in whatever the psyllium, so call it heavy metals. How much is it? Lead? Is it mercury? Is it, what's the heavy metal you're talking about? Then you have to, because some of it is going to be unavoidable. The plant takes up water and nutrients, and heavy metals come through that. Now, it can be that you get heavy metals from inappropriate use of pesticides or pest control, or maybe industrial activity in that area. But determining what the safe level is complicated. That is a whole different, like there are people, that's what they do, is exposure studies. So with heavy metals, there are two risks that you face. One is at a food safety risk. So if you want to know about like what types of levels could cause real problems, that cinnamon recall that FDA found out, I think it ended up being intentionally adulterated, but nevertheless, they give levels of lead like 2 parts per million or something like that. Very unusual. Usually it's parts per billion that you get. So finding out what the level is, but also understanding how much is going to be consumed. Because, if not much is going to be consumed, the actual exposure the person is exposed to is less. Also, there's a massive difference between young, infants, young people, because they're developing the brain, they're developing a lot of things. And this is where I think, from what I've seen, heavy metals can really cause issues. Whereas you and I, it's not that we want to consume lead, but
we're still young.
Yeah. But we're not developing, and so it's different tolerances. But that's you will see more of that, where you're going to have to work with toxicologists to really look at exposure and consumption and come up with what is the number. And I think the big trend that's concerning is not so much that we're going to be exposed to these things. I think my concern is I see that presence of the hazard is equal to risk in a lot of what the EU is going through this. FDA is, I think, trying to not go that direction, but you do see this where it's like, well, lead's not good for you. So, okay, get that it's not good for you, but at what level? Because it's part of nature. So what's achievable rather than just say, I ban it because it's there. So I think you're going to see more interest in chemical hazards coming in the next 5-10 years. So this exposure consumption is going to be necessary. I think you're going to see more toxicologists employed at companies too, because it's when you go food safety. This is not something I learned in my career. It's mostly micro, mostly that. But when you get into things like that, I certainly wasn't taught that. I've learned it. Yeah.
But do you think it's supposed to be part, or should be part of food safety long term?
Sure. I think that maybe to sum it up better, when we do a hazard analysis, we're really, if you think about, we're looking for acute response, right? If you eat salmonella, you get sick. Pet eats aflatoxin, pet gets sick or dies. That's acute. Once you get into chronic, like, okay, what happens if you consume this for 40 years? All right, well, all of the food safety tools that we have currently don't address that. So, but there are tools that do. And that's that part about where you learn how to do exposure analysis and combine it with consumption. And there's a lot of statistics around it. And again, because these elements are at very small levels, right? When you're talking about chronic response, you have to really make sure that the method is valid for the level that you're talking about. So if you have a method that can detect 10 parts per billion accurately and with precision, and then you get results at 4 parts per billion and start using that number to do statistics and make decisions. That's not the proper way. You have to get a method that's more sensitive and valid at that level. And I think that's lost on a lot of people, because I get it. It's not a simple principle. It takes a little bit of thought around it. So there are tools, but for chronic things like heavy metals, pesticides, that kind of, the food safety world's going to have to bring new tools to bear, because I do think that all of the regulatory agencies that I've seen are getting more concerned about what is the chronic exposure to things. And FDA, even in the FSMA regulations, does not dismiss chronic. They include it. It's still there. So you still, from a compliance perspective, I think they're going to come up with limits. And then it might not even be that it's not about safety. It's about this is the rule, which is also important when you're making things.
84 million times a day, pets eat meals with ingredients from Trow Nutrition. We bring together the science of ingredients, nutrition, and blending to unleash possibilities for pet food brands. Premixes are just the start. Turn to Trow for higher inclusion ingredients too, like proteins and carbohydrates, and highly sensitive ingredients like probiotics. With our palatants and base blends, you can feel confident about what comes in our bags and goes in yours. Learn more at TrowNutritionPets.com.
Yeah, we're almost at the end of our time. Just like a very final question to the heavy metals. Do you think that that's definitely increasing, right, in the soil, or is this because of pollution, or is there really a clear trend of increase, or is it also something we're just recognizing more?
Yeah, I think I don't. I know people that could answer that. They spent their whole career. I don't know whether it's increasing. But I do know that it comes from multiple sources, and some there are corrective actions that could be taken. Right? If you have a water problem, you can probably do something about it in some cases, and in some cases, or if they're applying pesticides with heavy metals, that's corrective. But there are some where there's natural levels. Maybe the soil you are in has high metal, and maybe it's even good for growing. But what are you going to do? So I think there's a lot more work to be done on what the risk is. And
well, it's really amazing to see you still so excited about everything, and I think it was really beautiful insight. Let me ask you a very final question because you're so excited. So, what makes a professional like you successful compared to someone who's not successful? If you reflect on your career,
it is the passion to master your product and process, and it really came from my parents. This rule: you work 8 hours a day. Everybody probably works more, but there are 8 really good hours. A lot of times when people work longer, the efficiency goes down and sometimes the decisions get worse. But so 8 good hours for work. You have 8 more hours in your day, before you go to sleep. And you get to choose what you're going to do with those 8 hours, right? So you can watch TV, play video games. You can do whatever you want to do. But you also can maybe work an extra hour or two to do your job better. You can also learn more. So during my entire career, I've always had a passion to understand when someone, even from experts, from the maintenance manager, anything, learn more about that topic. Take some of that 8 hours and learn more. It might be an online course. It might be, go to the plant and take a look around and talk to people. So I think for my whole career, because I was passionate, that was easy to do. But then it translates into, once you know how your product is made and all of the things, right? You don't understand sampling, so you have to read about it. You have to learn about it. But once you have all that, what you'll find is that, one, you can make pragmatic decisions for your company, which will enhance your career. You can interact with regulatory agencies in a way that never ask them questions about your process. You tell them your process. They can disagree with you, right? And then you'll have to work that out. But many times, if you say, no, I assess the risk, it's this is what we do, this is how we handle it, that's enough. That's really what they want to know is, do you know how to make it safe?
Yeah.
And so I would say that, remember that 8 hours. You don't have to just come home, and it's important. But even as my dad said, even if you took an hour and put it into work or learning, the benefits are huge over your lifetime.
No, that's wonderful. That's a really great summary of your career and so on. So thank you so much, Scott.
Yep, I appreciate your time.
Yeah, so that concludes another episode of the Pet Food Science Podcast presented by Wysenetics. And thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe so we're going to learn more about all different areas of pet food science. Until next time, this is Jan Sugodolski, and see you soon. Bye-bye.